can say the F word in public, but you say the J word, Jesus, and all heck breaks loose. Seriously, I'd like to know the answer to that question. And we're going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about the state of speech in America. It's not good. It's not looking good. I'm Cheryl Chumley, and this is Bold and Blunt, giving you a Christian conservative look at today's news, politics, culture, and events. And as you might guess by the title, I am far from politically correct. I don't have an issue speaking my mind. And yet in America right now, there are plenty of people who are afraid to speak their minds. Why? They don't want to be attacked. They don't want to be condemned. They don't want to be protested. They don't want to be trolled on social media. They don't want to be trolled to the point on social media where people actually start targeting their jobs, their places of employment, their abilities to make money and provide for their families. I get that. People are afraid to speak out. People are afraid to say certain things in America right now. First off, because they'll be booted off of social media. And maybe some people still care about that. Maybe some people think that Facebook is as powerful as Zuckerberg would like it to be. Maybe some people think that Twitter is as influential as Dorsey believes it to be, and they're afraid of losing those platforms. To be honest, as a member of the media, I use social media because it's what gets my stuff out there for you all kind members of the public to read, which segues nicely into this quick side note. If you are a regular Bold and Blunt listener, why not go to WashingtonTimes.com/Cheryl and sign up for a year's subscription to the digital platform of the Washington Times. We're giving you, the Washington Times is giving you a 50% discounted rate for the full year's access. And if you would, I'm just going to ask you straight out right. I'm going to ask you non-politically correctly to go to WashingtonTimes.com, find my name hyperlinked, right? Click on it. And if you go to the bottom of my commentaries, you'll see other links that will take you to a page where you can subscribe to my newsletter. You can become a regular subscriber, a regular recipient of my 3 times a week newsletter right to your email box that contains all my commentaries for the week, as well as my twice weekly podcasts. Why search for what you can get delivered oh so easily with just a few seconds time? I really would appreciate that. Anyhow, back to the topic at hand. The stifling of free speech in America. The stifling of conservative thought. It's not just speech after all. It's thought, right? If you tell somebody to shut up long enough times, over and over, and that person does, that person at some point during the moments, minutes, months of inflicted silence starts to wonder why, starts to reflect on the reasons for the stifling of speech, starts to look inward, starts to wonder, is there something wrong with me? Am I saying something that's wrong? I mean, that's just human nature, right? You start to wonder, what am I doing wrong? What have I said that's wrong? Maybe I am wrong. And you know, if you're not as strong on your principles, or you're not as experienced in speaking out, or you're not as bold and blunt, perhaps, as others, it may become easier for you to just go along to get along and stop speaking out, right? Well, that's when the left wins. Score, that's what the left wants. The left wants to shut down any speech they deem intolerable. And to me, it's so curious that it is far less controversial in America nowadays to go about on social media, in the streets, in places of public, on public stages, while delivering speeches, and drop the F bomb. Say, effing this, effing that, F this, F that. And yet, try and talk about Jesus. Try and talk about Jesus in a positive way, that is. And you'll be condemned. You'll be shut down. You'll be shut down faster than I can say you'll be shut down. The moral compass of this society is badly skewed. It truly is. Look at what passes for acceptable conversation, acceptable media imagery. I mean, on sitcoms, on television, on video games. Look at what you hear in the grocery stores nowadays, just walking around with your kids trying to pick up a gallon of milk and a loaf of bread. Listen to how people walk by you and the conversations that they so loudly engage in, dropping the F-bomb and worse. In front of kids, that used to be taboo. Now, it seems like the left glories in being as vulgar and as disgusting as they can in public. But again, say Jesus, speak about godly principles, bring up the Bible, talk about things that used to pass in this country for normal discussions, normal acceptable rhetoric, and you won't just be mocked, you'll be attacked. We don't so much have a cancel culture problem in this country as we do a culture problem. It's out of the culture that the cancel culture came. If we had a culture of true acceptance and tolerance based on proper morals and values, we wouldn't have to worry about canceling speech deemed offensive. We wouldn't have to worry about those on the left deeming speech that's not really offensive as offensive and then trying to cancel it out. So the cancel culture is not by itself the problem. The bigger problem is the culture, which leads to such things like insistence on political correctness or canceling by the left against speech from the conservative right, from the Christian right. I want to tell a quick story about my older daughter. She's 26 now. But when she was in, I think it was middle school, she was in public school. I have 4 kids. 3 of them went through the public school systems. The 4th, I grabbed out of public school because of Barack Obama's transgender policy and my daughter's fear that my 4th child is also a girl. My daughter's fear of being in the bathroom next to a boy. And so I grabbed her out back in 7th grade or 6th grade, I think it was, and she went into private Christian school affiliated with her church. But my older daughter, she went through public school the whole time. And there was a point in her middle school when she was asked to write an essay. It was an assignment for her class, an essay about Christmas, what she liked about Christmas, her favorite things about Christmas. And at first, she wrote things like the apple pie and the cookies and the presents and things like that. And I had a discussion with her about the essay, and I asked her why she left out the most important thing about Christmas, Jesus. And she said that she would have gotten in trouble had she written the essay naming Jesus in the essay as the most important thing about Christmas. And so she decided, though, that on her own, she decided that the heck with it. she was going to stand by her principles and turn in the essay that she really wanted to write. And she wrote about Jesus' birthday. She made that the prominent aspect of her essay. And then she added in all the other great things about Christmas, including pie, which is not just a Christmas great thing. It's an everyday great thing, right? We can celebrate pie every day. We don't have to hold off just on Christmas. But I think I'm deviating a bit from my point. I get distracted thinking about pie and cake especially. Don't even get me going down a trail of cake because that is such a weakness. And it's not so much the cake, it's the frosting with the little bit of cake added in. But again, I think I'm deviating. So back to my daughter and her essay. So she ended up turning in the essay that mentioned Jesus and so forth. And, you know, she didn't get dinged for it. Her teacher, to her teacher's credit, wrote a little note on her essay about how she agreed. And this is the thing. Sometimes in America, the point there are a few takeaways from this. First off, stand by your principles. If you believe in Jesus and you believe that this nation has a culture problem, stand by that belief and speak up. Don't let the left stifle you. My daughter didn't. My daughter took a stand and she did it, and it ended up good for her. And second off, let's not let the left crush our youth, because this is where their battle has headed, right? Anybody who has kids in the school systems in America knows that the left is actively, busily trying to erase the moral compass that parents have instilled and instead bring in this vulgar, coarse, secular, atheist even, belief system. Why? Because if you can raise a generation to believe that anything goes, there are no standards, there are no moral constraints, then chaos results. And once chaos comes in, well, who's going to come in and save the country from the chaotic times? The government. Because they've spent so many years erasing all morals and values and instilling atheist beliefs that there is no God at that point to step in as the savior of humanity. Government comes in, steps in, becomes the savior, and in the left's mind becomes the holders of power. Tell me I'm wrong. Tell me that's not what the battle's about. The left wants power. The left wants power and control, total power and control. And going after freedom of speech, going after free speech, going after speech, which is the natural outcome of thoughts, is one way the left is hunting for their power right now. And my guest today knows this full well. As a matter of fact, he knows it probably better than most because he's written the book about it. It's called Speechless: Controlling Words, Controlling Minds. Look, that title right there says it all. But what's great about this book, and the author and my guest is Michael Knowles. What's great about this book is that it's not just your typical conservatives say free speech is good, liberals say free speech is bad. It's not just that old tired talking point, right? Michael Knowles gives a historical perspective of how the politically correct culture has swept into America. And look, that's powerful because once you have the history, once you understand the roots, you are so much better equipped to fight and fight effectively than without knowing the roots of the problem, right? If you want to cure something, you need to go to the root. You can't just fight this and that and this and that, the little moles that pop up along the way. So, Michael Knowles, thank you so much for being on Bold and Blunt. I really appreciate your time.
No, the pleasure is all mine. Thank you for having me.
So your new book, Speechless, Controlling Words, Controlling Minds. I noticed Regnery, your publisher, put out in the promo on regnery.com. The culture war is over and the culture lost. Can you explain what's meant by that?
The culture war, as we have understood it for the past 3 or 4 decades, say, is a series of conservative losses with basically no break in between them.
True.
A friend of mine said that the difference between a conservative optimist and a conservative pessimist is that a conservative pessimist says things can't get any worse, and a conservative optimist says, oh, yes, they can. So I am here with the optimistic message that things can and will continue to get worse unless we change strategy. The scourge has long gone by the name political correctness. Today we also use the terms wokeness or cancel culture, new words to describe the same old problem. And because PC very often redefines words, it's no surprise that they've got new terms for it. But it's the same old problem. And political correctness is a purely negative campaign to abolish our society's traditional standards. And I trace this history going back about 100 years, and it begins really in the 1920s and then enters the public imagination beginning in around the 1980s. We have traditionally understood this problem as a battle between free speech and censorship, but I think that's a trap to think of that this way. I think that political correctness is actually a battle between two competing sets of standards, and it lays a trap for conservatives whereby either way we react to PC actually advances that destructive agenda. The first way in which conservatives react, the squishy way, is by simply acquiescing, going along with the new standards. Obviously, that advances the left's agenda. Mm-hmm. But even the more stalwart conservatives who stand up against the new speech codes and who insist that they are, for instance, free speech absolutists, why, they abandon standards entirely. And this also advances the left's agenda because either way, the traditional standards are abandoned, right, which is the entire point of PC. And because nature abhors a vacuum, the new leftist standards take their place. So I think that if conservatives want to reverse this ceaseless line of losses in the culture war, we're going to need to change strategy and change strategy quickly.
Now, what I like about your book, and I haven't read it, but I've started to read parts of it, and I know what's been said about it. And instead of just taking that tired bullet point, free speech, we need it, versus free speech needs to be shut down, you actually trace the history. And you mentioned that you found that this PC culture started in the 1920s. Do you have concrete examples of some of the stifling of free speech that took place back then?
I do. Really what begins in the 20s and the 30s is the construction of the intellectual framework of political correctness. And I appreciate the compliment that I'm not just regurgitating the same old talking points, because I really did try to dig in on this book and to take a fresh perspective on the issue, because whatever we're doing at the moment clearly is not working. And my first book was entirely devoid of words. It was called Democrats, A Comprehensive Guide. So I figured it would be ironic to make my second book entirely about words, and I decided to do a bit more research than even I had done for my magnum opus.
That's great.
So I, in the process of writing the book, actually began to change my mind about what political correctness is, as well as how we can fight against it. I think that we on the right flatter ourselves by believing that we understand free speech and censorship better than the left does. I don't think that's true. I think that the men going back to the 20s who created this scourge were often very brilliant, very educated individuals who came up with a very clever political strategy. And I think that we dismiss and deride that strategy at our own peril. I think tactically it's brilliant. And I think the key to it is that these leftist intellectuals recognized that all speech regimes have limits. From the very beginning of our country, whole swaths of speech have been off limits. Threats, fraud, sedition, obscenity. And this remains true today, although the standards have shifted considerably. In the 1950s, you would be canceled for being a communist. Today, you will be canceled for not being a communist.
Right.
The fact of cancel culture has not changed, but the criteria of that culture have. And so going back to the 20s, what Antonio Gramsci, brilliant Marxist philosopher and founder of the Italian Communist Party, who exerts tremendous intellectual influence on the left, actually one of the preeminent Gramsci scholars in America, one of the founders of the Gramsci Society, was Joseph Buttigieg, the father of Pete Buttigieg. Even one of the most milquetoast Democrats in the country can boast this very radical intellectual pedigree. And the ideas of someone like Gramsci, later on the Frankfurt School in the 1930s, then really rears its ugly head again in the 60s with one of those Frankfurt School theorists, Herbert Marcuse, as the father of the New Left. Totally penetrates the academy. Now we're having a big debate over one of the derivations of that movement, critical race theory. But it's pervaded the academy and the legal system and basically all of the prevailing institutions, because what Gramsci called for was leftists to attain cultural hegemony that he said they could do by waging a war of position, as opposed to a war of maneuver where one advances and retreats, a war of position whereby radicals attained positions of authority in all of the institutions, and then once they held those positions, actually wielded political power, not to transform a totally free speech regime into a regime of total censorship, but more subtly, more powerfully, to shift the standards of what is acceptable and what is not acceptable in society. All societies have taboos and standards. The question is which ones we will recognize, and the left has done so masterfully for 100 years, and we have a lot of catching up to do.
But you know what? And I just want to mention that you keep fading out a little. I don't know if you're turning your head or pacing, but we're hanging on a thread to catch every single one of your words. And you're very interesting what you're speaking of, so I don't want people to miss what you're saying. But the point here, too, is it's not just the left. You yourself have been targeted by what Americans would think of as more the conservative base. When you were on Fox News a couple years ago, you made the very common sense factual remark that Greta Thunberg was mentally ill, which, based on what the world of science and psychology deems mentally ill, you were just stating a fact. And Fox actually came out and apologized to viewers for that.
I was dismayed and disappointed in the reaction of some network executives. Network executives, particularly on the right, are not known for having particularly strong spines. But I was also perplexed by the reaction, because I obviously meant no disrespect, and I was repeating a fact that actually that young climate activist's mother had written about at great length in a book,
yes.
and that the activist herself had mentioned. So I was criticizing the left for exploiting not only a child, but a child with particular challenges. And then this was twisted by not just the left, but also by putatively conservative people to attempt to cancel me. And as Winston Churchill writes in his memoir, My Early Life, there is nothing more exhilarating than to be shot at and missed. I was pleased to have survived that cancellation attempt. But I think it goes to, I really don't even mean to go after Fox News for their reaction.
No.
There are many people ostensibly on the right who cave to the predations of cancel culture and political correctness because the pressure is so intense and because the left has such institutional power. And I think that conservatives spend a lot of time defending free speech in the abstract, or defending freedom of belief in the abstract, but they when the pressure is hot, very often they will cave because free speech means nothing to those who have nothing to say. It is incumbent upon conservatives. I'm not singling out a single network here by any means. It is incumbent upon conservatives everywhere in the culture to articulate a substantive vision of politics. We actually can say some things are right and some things are wrong.
Right.
As I was saying when I said that it's wrong to exploit children in politics, we can actually say that some things are good and some things are bad. It's not merely a matter of subjective preference. These are matters of objective truth. And if you really believe, as some liberal Republicans have said, as some of the squishes have said, that there's no way to, for instance, ban drag queen story hour because then the left will ban us from going to church on Sunday. I would say, first of all, as a practical matter, they're already banning us from going to church. They've been doing it for the better part of a year now during the coronavirus lockdowns in many places. But even as a philosophical matter, if we really can't distinguish between perverts tweaking for toddlers in church on Sunday, if we can't distinguish between true and false and right and wrong, then we cannot govern ourselves, because self-government requires on the ability of the people to make those distinctions and to articulate them, and those will be exclusive claims, and if something is true, then it's not false, and we actually can say that. But unfortunately, courage is not only a virtue, but the prerequisite for all of the other virtues. And I've long said, I hope that people like Donald Trump, notably, live very long lives, but finally death comes for us all, and when Donald Trump goes to his eternal reward, I hope he donates his body to science and his spine to the conservative movement, because they've been lacking that courage for a very long time.
Which is what the left counts on, right? Because conservatives maybe don't want to offend, so they bend over backwards so as not to offend. And the left swoops in and takes advantage of this and exploits it. And, you raised a good point a minute ago when you talked about the ability to govern ourselves. This is what the left's endgame is with playing with rhetoric, right? They want to swoop in and become the controllers, not just of speech, but, as your book points out, of minds.
Of course, and this process is inevitable. Speech will color the way that we view the world. As Aristotle points out, man is the political animal because we have speech. We don't just grunt and smack each other on the head with clubs. If you look at Congress today, perhaps you would think that were the case. But ideally, in a political society, you use your speech to persuade one another of things. And so the control of speech is the control of politics. This is true of big tech oligarchs who presume to censor the duly elected sitting president of the United States, as they did back in January. And this is true of the subtler strategy of forcing everyone to use incorrect pronouns. Sometimes conservatives of the squishier variety will throw up their hands and say, oh, who cares if we call Bruce Jenner he or she? It's not a big deal. Just forget about it. Well, my answer to who cares is the left seems to care. The left is investing a lot of time and energy and money and resources into this pronoun game and into pushing this radical gender ideology. And I suspect it's because words carry whole premises with them. And if you can sneak in some new language, you can smuggle in a whole new vision of politics. What the left often tries to do is to redefine reality by redefining all of the words. All societies use euphemisms. And some euphemisms just soften harsh truths. So we refer to a woman of a certain age instead of an old lady. Because she really is a woman of a certain age, and we all know what we're talking about. We refer to passing away instead of dying, because passing away describes at least the spiritual fact of death. But when we call a man in a dress a trans woman or simply a woman, we're not softening reality. We're actually inverting it. There's one euphemism that's cropped up in the PC jargon that is particularly ironic, and this is the trend of referring to criminals as justice-involved people. Now, they're not involved in justice. They're actually involved in injustice. That is the defining quality of a criminal. But what they do these wordsmiths, what they will do is they will pervert the language so as actually to invert society. And so it's not merely the fact of censorship, but it's even the pre-censorship. The language that we use will totally warp the way we view the world to the advantage of the left.
Yep, it's flipping truth for lie and lie for truth. And Michael Knowles, you seem brilliant. You lay out this fight very well. We didn't get to solutions, but you know what? That gives people more incentive to buy your book. Speechless, Controlling Words, Controlling Minds. I want to thank you so much for your time and for writing this book. I look forward to reading it.
Well, thank you so much. The pleasure's been all mine.
God bless. You know, Candace Owens actually wrote this great review for this book, for Speechless. She writes, "Every single American needs to read Michael Knowles' Speechless. I don't mean read it eventually. I mean, stop what you're doing and pick up this book." Senator Ted Cruz writes, "The most important book on free speech in decades. Read it." Look, those are two great endorsements for the book, but this is something, if you want to know the history, if you want to know the roots of the PC culture, pick up Speechless, check it out, learn to fight more effectively. And guess what? In the meanwhile, stay blunt, stay bold.